Hello and welcome to today's webinar, A Flexitarian Approach to Sustainable Healthy Diets. This complimentary one-credit continuing education webinar is brought to you with support from Danone North America. Before we start the presentation, I have 3 points of housekeeping. First, Tango Communications was approved by the CDR to offer 1 CEU for this webinar. Second, to claim your CPE credit, you will have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Finally, at the end of the session, our presenter will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in your control panel, and we will try to address as many questions as time allows. And now I'd like to hand things off to Amanda Bleckman, RD CDN, Senior Manager Scientific Affairs, Danone North America, to introduce today's speaker. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm really so happy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so glad that Danone North America can support webinars and other valuable learning opportunities like this one that are so often offered by today's dietitian. I'm so proud to be a dietitian at Danone North America. We are a purpose-driven company and an industry leader in the food and beverage category. We're a certified B Corporation, and as a certified B Corp, Danone North America is committed to the creation of both economic and social value while nurturing natural ecosystems through sustainable agriculture. With more than 6,000 employees and 14 production locations across the U.S. and Canada, Danone North America's mission is to bring health through food to as many people as possible. So now, without further ado, I would love to welcome today's speaker. Christine McCullum-Gómez, PhD, RDN, and LD, is a food and nutrition consultant, speaker, and writer. Her areas of expertise include community-based participatory research, community food security, environmental nutrition, food and nutrition policy, and sustainable food systems. She serves on the editorial review board and as a column editor for the Journal of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition. Dr. McCullum-Gómez holds a PhD in nutritional sciences from Cornell University with minors in public affairs, public policy, and program evaluation, as well as a master's and a bachelor's degree in nutritional sciences from the Pennsylvania State University. She has received numerous awards, including a National Cancer Institute postdoctoral fellowship and the Excellence in Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Award from the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Christine McCullum-Gómez.
Thank you, Amanda, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, A Flexitarian Approach to Sustainable Healthy Diets, How a Flexitarian Diet Leaves Room for Modest Amounts of Animal Products while balancing the needs of the planet. The learning objectives for today's webinar are as follows. First, to identify the principles of a flexitarian diet. Second, to describe the nutritional advantages of a flexitarian diet. Third, list potential health benefits and health cost savings of adopting a flexitarian diet. And fourth, discuss how a flexitarian diet contributes to reducing environmental impacts of the food system. I've also included the performance indicators as well as the CDR activity type, CPE level, and CEUs. I've created this presentation outline that I will be using throughout the webinar to create a flow and transition between the related topics. First, I'd like to give a brief overview of consumer trends as they relate to plant-based eating and sustainability. Based on 1,000 interviews with adults aged 18 years and older from December 3rd through December 5th, 2020, plant-based topped the list of eating patterns or diet types heard about most in the news in 2020. 22% of respondents said they had heard about plant-based eating patterns. And based on 1,009 interviews conducted among adults 18 years and older from November 9th through November 10th, 2020, 65% of respondents tried at least one new type of plant protein for the first time in the past year. 28% tried plant alternatives to meat, 24% tried new varieties of milk alternatives, and 21% tried varieties of other dairy alternatives, such as plant-derived yogurt or cheese. Vegetarians, vegans, pescatarians, people under 45, and college-educated respondents were generally more likely to have tried new plant protein options, while omnivores, white persons, those 65 years or older, and non-college-educated respondents were more likely not to have tried any types of plant proteins in the past year. What is plant-based eating? As you can see here, plant-based eating occurs along a continuum. There are different forms. And while plant-based eating focuses on foods primarily from plants, not all diets eliminate all animal products. On the left, we have vegans who do exclude all animal products from their diet. Next, lacto-vegetarians who exclude meat, fish, and eggs, but include dairy foods. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians who exclude meat and fish, but include dairy foods and eggs. Pescatarians who exclude meat, but include fish and or shellfish, dairy foods, and eggs. And finally, flexitarians who include modest amounts of dairy foods, eggs, meat, and fish. Packaged Facts conducted a national online consumer survey in August of 2020, where it asked consumers which diet or eating philosophy they are currently following. A majority, or 53% of consumers, report being primarily omnivorous, while 36% identify themselves as flexitarian, meaning they are reducing but not eliminating meat and other animal products from their diet. 3% of consumers follow a vegan diet, 3% are pescatarian, and 5% are vegetarian based on the results from this online survey. With regard to sustainability, nearly 6 out of 10 consumers say it is important what products they purchase are produced in an environmentally sustainable way. The share of consumers who say environmental sustainability has a real impact on their purchases is up from 27% in 2019 to 34% in 2020. 63% of consumers agree it is hard to know whether food choices are environmentally sustainable. Of these consumers, about 70% say making it easier to know would influence their decisions more. So now that we've briefly reviewed some consumer trends as they relate to plant-based eating and sustainability, what is a sustainable food system? I've included 2 definitions here. First is for food systems, and second is for a sustainable food system, these definitions being provided by FAO. Food systems encompass the entire range of actors and their interlinked value-adding activities involved in the production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal of food products that originate from agriculture, forestry, or fisheries, and parts of the broader economic, societal, and natural environments in which they are embedded. A sustainable food system is a food system that delivers food security and nutrition for all in a way that the economic, social, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are not compromised. In order to be sustainable, the development of the food system needs to generate positive value along 3 dimensions simultaneously: economic, social, and environmental. Sustainability in food systems includes an evaluation of a food system's economic impacts, its environmental impacts, and its social impacts. Examples of economic impacts include profits for enterprises, jobs and income for workers, tax revenues for governments, and food supply improvements for consumers. Environmental impacts include carbon and water footprints, water and soil health, animal and plant health, food loss and food waste, biodiversity, and toxicity. With regard to social impacts include added value distribution, especially for high-risk or vulnerable groups. Social impacts also include effects on cultural traditions, nutrition and health, workers' rights and safety, animal welfare, and institutions. So now that we've briefly reviewed the different dimensions of a sustainable food system, let's pay more attention to the consumption end, that is, sustainable and sustainable healthy diets. I've included some basic definitions for sustainable diets as well as sustainable healthy diets. In 2012, the FAO and Biodiversity International came up with the following definition of sustainable diets. Sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. In 2018, Dr. Marco Springman and colleagues noted that the concept of sustainable diets combines the challenges of creating a food system that supplies healthy diets for a growing population while reducing its environmental impacts and staying within planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries being the biophysical limits that humanity should operate within to ensure a stable and resilient Earth. And in 2019, FAO and WHO presented the following definition of sustainable healthy diets. Sustainable healthy diets are dietary patterns that promote all dimensions of an individual's health and well-being, have low environmental pressure and impact, are accessible, affordable, safe and equitable, and are culturally acceptable. Examples of healthy and sustainable diets are those high in coarse grains, pulses, fruits and vegetables, and nuts and seeds, low in energy-intensive animal source foods such as beef and pork, and discretionary foods such as sugary beverages and with a carbohydrate threshold. So why are sustainable healthy diets important? First and foremost, our global food system is contributing to both human health and planetary health crises. In fact, obesity, undernutrition, and climate change have been described as a synergy of pandemics in that they all share food and agricultural systems as an underlying driver. In terms of human health crisis, changes in consumption patterns have contributed to about 2 billion adults now being overweight or obese. At the same time, almost 690 million persons were hungry in 2019, or about 8.9% of the world population. In addition, more than 3 billion people could not afford a healthy diet. The global food system is a major driver of climate change, land use change, biodiversity loss, depletion of freshwater resources, and pollution of ecosystems. And as demand for foods with greater environmental impacts, such as meat, increases, and global population grows from a projected 7 to 10 billion in the next 30 years, environmental impacts are expected to intensify. The IPCC report on climate change noted that there are various potential health and environmental benefits associated with sustainable healthy diets. Consumption of healthy and sustainable diets presents major opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food systems and improving health. Similarly, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biodiversity stated that a dietary pattern higher in plant-based foods, for example, vegetables, fruits, legumes, seeds, nuts, and whole grains, and lower in animal-based foods is healthier and gives rise to lower greenhouse gas emissions and land use change compared to existing diets. Furthermore, a systematic review of dietary patterns and sustainability in the United States by Sarah Reinhardt and colleagues noted that among healthy dietary patterns, those higher in plant-based foods and lower in animal-based foods would be beneficial for environmental sustainability. Of course, these authors noted that further research is needed. This slide gives an overview of the global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. We can see that the items included in orange and light green, AFLU, represent agriculture, forestry, and land use. And what is surprising to many is that AFLU comes in second at 24%, only to electricity at 25%. Agriculture represents 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and forestry and land use, 14%. If we look at agriculture, we can see that greenhouse gases are coming from a variety of sources. Methane from animals represents 5%. Ruminant animals, including cattle, sheep, and goats, release methane, a potent greenhouse gas, when digesting food, mainly in the form of burps, but also to a lesser extent flatulence. There are also methane emissions from manure management and disposal, and aquaculture also emits methane. Next up is nitrous oxide, another potent greenhouse gas, coming in at 4%. This is emitted through the use of synthetic fertilizers and manure. And then finally, 1% of methane is released via flooded rice fields. In addition to emissions from U.S. agriculture production, there are also greenhouse gas emissions with devoting land to agriculture. And in analyses that do not include land use and land use change, those analyses are most likely to underestimate emissions. This includes cutting down forests to establish new pasture land for animals, as well as cropland to grow seed crops that are then in turn fed to animals. We can see that land use change in forestry represents 9% of the 14%, and other food, agriculture, and land use, 5%. To assess the various foods' environmental impacts, authors Poor and Nemecek consolidated covering 5 environmental indicators: greenhouse gas emissions, land use, acidification and eutrophication, which contribute to nutrient pollution, and water scarcity across 38,700 farms and 1,600 processors, packaging types, and retailers. In their publication, they looked at 40 major foods across 9 different food categories. However, in the interest of time for today's webinar, I will only have a chance to review the first 2. A, protein-rich products. Grains are also included here as they contribute 41% of total protein intake despite their low protein content. And category B, milks. If we look at the bottom of the figure, you can see the figure key includes the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile, as well as the mean and the median. If we look at the first 3 food items included in category A, protein-rich products per 100 grams of protein, we can see that the first 2 items, beef from a beef herd and lamb and mutton, have higher means than the other items listed, 50 and 20 respectively. If we come down lower, we can see that within the category of protein-rich foods, farm crustaceans has a mean of 18, cheese 11, lower yet, farm fish at 6, tofu at 2, ground nuts at 1.2, and nuts at 0.3. Looking at land use, coming up back to the top, again, we can see that beef from a beef herd and lamb and mutton score at the top with 164 and 185 respectively for the means. Coming down lower within this category, we can see farm crustaceans at 2, cheese 41, farm fish 3.7, poultry 7.1. Coming down to the plant-based protein sources, we can see tofu here at 2.2, ground nuts at 3.5, and nuts at 7.9. If we look at the second category, milks, we can see cow's milk as well as soy milk. With regard to greenhouse gas emissions, the mean comes in at 3.2 for cow's milk and 1.0 for soy milk. Coming over to land use, again, we can see for the mean for cow's milk 8.9 and 0.7 for soy milk. The authors concluded that a combination of environmental labels such as carbon labels, taxes, and subsidies could be used to better reflect the true environmental cost of food and promote more sustainable food consumption by consumers. This next slide is based on data taken from Clark and Tillman, environmental impacts of broad food groups per kilocalorie. We can see here within this figure that meats are included in red, seafood in blue, dairy and eggs in gray, and plant-based foods in green at the top. Bars show both the means and standard errors. They looked at 5 different environmental indicators: greenhouse gas emissions, land use, energy use, acidification potential, and eutrophication potential. If we start at the bottom, we can see that ruminant meats have the largest environmental impacts across the 5 different indicators. Coming up next, we have different forms of aquaculture and fisheries, including recirculating, non-recirculating, trawl, and non-trawl fisheries. Trawling is actually a method of fishing that involves pulling a fishing net through water behind one or more boats. We can see here, looking at the means as well as the standard errors, there's quite a bit of variability depending on the type of aquaculture or fishery practices that are being implemented. Next up are pork and poultry, which have lower environmental impact than the ruminant meats, but higher than some of the other foods. Dairy and eggs, next up, lower environmental impact than meat. And then finally, produce, rice, wheat, and maize have the lowest environmental impact of all. Since these data by Poor and Nemecek and Clark and Tillman have been published, researchers from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future published research in Global Environmental Change, where they assessed how alterations to dietary patterns across 140 countries would impact individual and country-level greenhouse gas emissions and freshwater use. One of the key findings was that a diet in which animal protein came predominantly from low food chain animals, such as small fish, mollusks, and insects, had comparably small greenhouse gas and water footprints as a vegan diet. In addition, a diet that reduced animal consumption by 2/3, or what's called the 2/3 vegan diet, generally had a lower climate and water footprint than the more traditional lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. The authors pointed out that while persons in high-income countries will have to make ambitious changes to their diets to reduce environmental impact, most low and middle-income countries will require a substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions and water use for food production in order to achieve an adequate, healthy diet. The bottom line for Americans is that cutting down on many animal products that they eat could make a significant difference to their greenhouse gas and freshwater footprints. In 2020, the nonprofit organization Project Drawdown ranked 76 climate change solutions in its second such report. Drawdown refers to the point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. In their analyses, they actually looked at 2 different scenarios. Scenario 1 included limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and scenario 2 included limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. What you can see as a commonality in both scenarios is that plant-rich diets appear in the top 5. Echoing these recent findings from Project Drawdown, a recent research study published in Science in November of 2020 concluded that climate goals cannot be reached without changes in the food system, including the adoption of plant-rich diets in order to limit warming this century to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the more ambitious target of the Paris Agreement on climate change. I also wanted to point out that the World Resources Institute has launched an initiative called the Cool Foods Initiative that is helping businesses and organizations cut the climate impact of the food they serve, and is also helping consumers choose cool food meals. For more information on that initiative, you can go to coolfood.org. Now that we understand why sustainable healthy diets are important, let's take a look at a sustainable foods transition to healthy diets. In 2019, the Eat Lancet Commission, which consisted of 37 internationally renowned scientists from 16 countries in various disciplines, including human health, nutrition, agriculture, economics, political science, and environmental sustainability, came together to develop the best evidence for healthy diets and sustainable food systems. The Commission determined that the global food system must operate within boundaries for human health and food production to ensure healthy diets from sustainable food systems for an estimated 10 billion people by the year 2050. The Commission developed global scientific targets for healthy diets and sustainable food production. It integrated them into a common framework called the Safe Operating Space for Food Systems, so that planetary health diets, which are both healthy and environmentally sustainable, could be identified. The Sustainable Food Systems transition to healthy diets included scientific targets for specific food groups to optimize human health, as well as scientific targets for sustainable food production to ensure a stable Earth system. We can see by the photos what we have now is a system that is not very stable. Planetary boundaries were proposed for 6 Earth system processes affected by food production. These planetary boundaries for food production include climate change, land system change, fresh water use, nitrogen recycling, phosphorus recycling, as well as biodiversity loss. So they've included the boundary or the control variable or how these systems are measured. The Commission came up with a planetary health diet. It is largely plant-based, but can optionally include modest amounts of fish, meat, and dairy foods. It recommends consuming a range of foods amounting to 2,500 kilocalories per day, which will promote health and well-being. Of course, the total number of kilocalories per day will vary based on age, gender, activity levels, and health profiles. It is meant to be flexible and recommends intake levels of various food groups, which can be adapted to local geography, culinary traditions, and personal preferences. Here is the actual planetary health diet by different food group category. What's included here are each of the specific food group categories, as well as the grams per day and the calorie intake, kilocalorie per day. Different food group categories include whole grains, tubers or starchy vegetables, fruits, dairy foods, protein sources, including both animal-based protein sources as well as plant-based protein sources, added fats, including unsaturated and saturated oils, as well as added sugars. If you're a visual person, you may want to go to the Eat Forum website. They actually have a picture of a planetary health diet plate that illustrates how much each specific food group represents across a typical food plate, or one that should be followed on the planetary health diet, I should say. The Eat Lancet Commission notes that the transition to healthy diets from sustainable food systems by the year 2050 will require a greater than 50% reduction in the global consumption of certain foods, such as red meat and sugar, and a doubling of the intake of nuts, fruits, and vegetables and legumes, although the changes needed will differ greatly by region. I should also point out that the planetary health diet does have its critics, including that it is unaffordable for at least 1.58 billion people, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, based on an analysis published in Lancet Global Health. Thus, to make this dietary pattern more affordable, increase earnings and safety net transfers, as well as improve local food production and supply, and an expansion of the range of lower-cost animal products and fruits and vegetables are needed for these consumers. In summary, the Eat Lancet Commission concluded that staying within a safe operating space for food systems requires a combination of substantial shifts towards mostly plant-based dietary patterns, dramatic reductions in both food losses and food waste, and major improvements in food production practices. Similarly, Logan and de Klerk note that the food we choose to eat, how much is lost or wasted, and how it is produced will determine whether or not we meet the Paris Climate Agreement and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Food systems must transition from being a net source of greenhouse gas emissions to a net sink Shifting toward healthy flexitarian diets is central to this goal. So what is a flexitarian diet? Included in the Oxford English Dictionary, flexitarian is a word combining two others, flexible and vegetarian. It refers to an individual who follows a primarily but not strictly vegetarian diet, occasionally eating meat or fish. It is sometimes referred to as a semi-vegetarian diet. Based on the Eat-Lancet Commission's definition, it is largely plant-based but can optionally include modest amounts of fish, meat, and dairy foods. It encourages variety rather than restriction, as you don't have to exclude any specific food. For most people, it is a realistic way to significantly reduce the quantity of animal-sourced foods in the diet. It is based on the following principles. Eat mostly fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, and whole grains. Focus on protein from plants instead of animals. Include dairy products and eggs. Be flexible and incorporate meat, poultry, fish, and seafood occasionally. Eat the least processed, most natural form of foods. Limit highly processed foods, and limit refined grains, added sugars, and sweets. So now that we know what is a flexitarian diet, what are the nuts and bolts on how to follow it, as this could be quite a challenge for some clients that you're currently working with. First, start small. Commit to one meat-free day per week, such as Meatless Monday, and then steadily adjust your diet. DJ Blattner, in her book on the flexitarian diet, discusses 3 different levels of flexitarianism based on the number of meatless days per week or ounces of meat per week: beginner, advanced, and expert flexitarianism. You can take a quiz in her book to determine your flex score, at which you can determine your current level of flexitarianism. Second, substitute half the meat content in your meals for a plant-based source of protein, such as beans or lentils. A bolognese pasta sauce made with half meat and half lentils, or a burger made with half meat and half beans. Over time, as your taste buds adjust, you can make these items using only plant-based sources of protein, if so desired. Third, make the most of plant-based alternatives, such as plant-based veggie burgers with pronounceable ingredients, tofu and tempeh. And fourth, dairy products and plant-based dairy alternatives such as yogurt and soy milk can coexist. Take inspiration from cuisines that traditionally use beans and lentils and bring out their flavor with herbs and spices, such as an Indian dal or curry, or Mediterranean soup or stew. Incorporate other nutrient-dense foods, such as dairy, to complement plant-based recipes. For example, add a dollop of yogurt to a lentil curry, or add a swirl of yogurt to a butternut squash soup. If you or your clients feel held back by your cooking skills, take a vegetarian or vegan cooking class. During the pandemic, culinary schools, restaurants, as well as some RDs are starting to offer online cooking classes. Prepare large batches of your favorite plant-based recipes. Freeze the leftovers or save them for the next day's lunch. Finally, plan the week's meals. This will minimize food waste and save you time and money. I've included some resources at the bottom of the slide to provide you and your clients with some example flexitarian recipes as well as sample meal plans. So now that we've gone over what is a flexitarian diet and how to follow it, what are some of the potential advantages and benefits? First, nutritional advantages. The principles of the flexitarian diet are aligned with the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. Both emphasize fruits, vegetables, dairy, whole grains, and a broad range of protein foods, such as lean meat and poultry, seafood, eggs, legumes, nuts and seeds, and soy products. By consuming more nutrient-dense foods and beverages, such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, dairy products, and fortified soy milks, one can increase their intake of nutrients of public health concern, including calcium, potassium, dietary fiber, and vitamin D. Within the flexitarian diet, the large quantity of plant-based foods balanced with a moderate intake of dairy products and low amounts of meat and sugar generally provide an all-around healthy mix of high-quality protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and unsaturated fatty acids. Dairy foods can be an important source of high-quality protein and calcium, as well as phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, iodine, and vitamins, such as vitamin A, vitamin D, B12, riboflavin, and zinc. And as noted by Mark Messina, the soybean is notable not only for its total protein content, but the quality of soy protein, which is higher than that of other plant proteins and similar to animal protein. And finally, within the milk alternatives category, soy milk has the highest protein content, almost the same as cow's milk, and is a plant-based source of complete protein. Fortified soy milk is also a nutrient-dense food that contains calcium, vitamin A, and vitamin D. With regard to potential health benefits, a review of the evidence-based literature published in 2017 concluded that there was emerging evidence suggesting that the flexitarian diet may provide benefits for weight management and metabolic health, including blood pressure and blood sugar. However, it should be pointed out that, as the author noted, one of the limitations is that the definitions of flexitarian diets tended to vary between the different studies that were assessed. A flexitarian diet may also offer substantial health cost savings. Adoption of any of the 4 alternative healthy dietary patterns that conform to the general recommendations of the Eat Landsat Commission on healthy diets from sustainable food systems would dramatically decrease diet-related health costs by 2030. Let's take a look at the figure. On the x-axis, we have the different diets. The first is current consumption or a benchmark diet. The remaining 4 are the 4 alternative healthy dietary patterns, including the flexitarian diet. On the y-axis, we have projected diet-related health costs. We can see that this includes both direct health costs as well as indirect health costs. Direct costs include expenses associated with treating different diseases, while indirect costs include losses in labor and work productivity and informal care associated with a specific disease. By the year 2030, following current consumption or the benchmark diet, these diet-related health costs are projected to be approximately 1.3 trillion, that's trillion US dollars. If there's a switch to a flexitarian diet instead, that brings down those total diet-related health costs to about 100 billion, representing a greater than 90% reduction of diet-related health expenditures worldwide compared to the benchmark diet scenario. A flexitarian diet may also provide potential environmental benefits. Based on a global modeling analysis, researchers found that adopting more plant-based flexitarian diets globally could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than half and reduce other environmental impacts, including nitrogen application as well. Changes in cropland use, freshwater use, and phosphorus application were split into reductions in high and middle income countries and increases in low income countries. A different modeling study found that a shift to vegetarian and flexitarian diets would bring 5 environmental footprints, including greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, freshwater use, nitrogen use, and phosphorus use well under planetary boundaries. Here, as we can see in this figure, adoption of any of the 4 alternative healthy dietary patterns that conform to the general recommendations of the Eat Lancet Commission on healthy diets from sustainable food systems could significantly reduce projected diet-related greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. If we look at the x-axis, we can see the variety of diets, including current consumption, as well as the 4 alternative healthy dietary patterns, including the flexitarian diet. On the y-axis is projected greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. We can see that the projected diet-related greenhouse gas emissions amount to about 8.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030, adjusted for income and population changes. However, adoption of any of the 4 alternative healthy dietary patterns would result in a substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, anywhere from a 41% to a 74% reduction by the year 2030. So what are the take-home messages? First, a flexitarian diet is a balanced diet rich in plant-based foods while still allowing for consumption of animal source products, including dairy, in moderation. It is generally a nutrient-dense diet that provides high-quality protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and unsaturated fatty acids. It may provide benefits for weight management and metabolic health, including blood pressure and blood sugar. Adoption of a flexitarian diet could substantially reduce diet-related health costs. It may reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts, including nitrogen application globally. Healthy diets from sustainable food systems are needed to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. Major changes are necessary to build a more sustainable food system, including dietary changes. A flexitarian diet is an example of a sustainable dietary pattern. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. We actually have gotten quite a few questions, so I'm just going to head back to the beginning, and we'll shift our mental gears back to some of the earlier slides. So the first question we got was, what is the carbohydrate threshold, which was from early on in the presentation?
Yeah, that was taken from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was published back in 2019. If you go to my final slides that are included after my contact information, you can find that information in that reference. I didn't want to get into specific details. I'm giving a brief overview. So I would refer you to the IPCC report published in 2019 on land use and climate change. It's included as a reference. If you can't find it there, I'd be more than happy to talk to you to see, if I can find it or we can find it elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question, what percentage of the greenhouse gases that you mentioned contribute to the total atmosphere's gases?
Okay, so when you say, so if you look at global greenhouse gases, the AFLU represents agriculture, forestry, and land use. Agriculture represented 10, forestry and land use represented 14%. If you go to the EPA's website, that same information in those amounts is included there. If you look at the entire food system, there are 2 recent numbers I've seen. In the IPCC report published in 2019, which again I've included as a reference, they note that up to 37% of greenhouse gases globally come from the entire food system. More recently, a publication in Nature Food estimated that about 34% of global greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, come from the food system. Are you looking at other pollutants as well? Can you restate the question?
I'm not sure. If that was your question, feel free to submit a rephrase in the Q&A, and I'll try to look for it. I'm just the messenger right now.
Yeah, there are other pollutants associated with agriculture, such as ammonia, but I was looking specifically at greenhouse gases. So yeah, if I didn't answer your question, please feel free to restate it and I'll try again.
Great. I'll move on to the next one. It says, I see that you're sharing GHG per calorie. What about GHG per nutrient?
Yeah, if you look at Dr. Michael Clark, who is a very formative researcher with regard to environmental impacts of foods as well as diets, I provided two references. One is from Tillman and Clark in 2017. The other is a more recent publication by him in 2020, which I've included in the reference list. And what he says is that if you look at environmental impacts, whether you look at per serving, per kilocalorie, or per gram, that the impacts, the trends are similar. So I would refer you to that publication because he is an eminent authority and that's his perspective.
Okay, next up, does any of the research look at carbon sequestering abilities of grasslands that could be increased with transition to more grass-fed animal agriculture?
Okay, yes. There are various sources. I didn't have time to get into all of this, but again, if you look at the very thorough IPCC report, which I'm looking, I have the report for technical summary, and there's a report for policymakers, which is shorter. They actually go into that in quite a big detail, and they talk about various land management strategies that can be used, something like agroforestry. If you look at the Project Drawdown report that looked at the top climate change solutions, they rank 76. If you look at the agricultural related solutions, they have things like silvopasturing, which is an agroforestry system. That's the practice of integrating trees, forage, and grazing of livestock in a mutually beneficial way. Silvopasturing has been more prominent in places like South America, but it is becoming more prominent in the U.S., especially in the South. Other agricultural-based practices that they talk about, silvopasturing actually ranked 11th as the 11th solution. And then there are going to be other things that are included like perennial crops, regenerative agriculture, other practices like that as well. So I would refer you again to these two additional references, the IPCC reports published in 2019 and the Project Drawdown report that was published in the fall of 2020. They get into some of that as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question, this is interesting. It's a question about the feeding of small amounts of seaweed to cows, which has been reported to reduce their methane emissions. I think the question is, are you familiar with this research, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I did hear about the feeding of the seaweed to cows to reduce methane. And I think that, we need all the help we can get. So any type of technological solution that can be implemented is wonderful. However, I also agree with Dr. Michael Clark, who said there's not going to be a silver bullet approach. We really need a combination of different types of approaches. And in fact, there was actually a recent study published in Nature Sustainability. And this author looked actually at meat consumption data between 1961 through 2013. And what they found is that the introduction of chicken and fish did not reduce production and consumption of other meats, including beef. Basically, what happened is beef consumption stayed about the same, but chicken consumption went up. So when you provided more choices, it actually resulted in higher levels of consumption. And he goes on to argue for the necessity of subsidizing, are we really doing the right thing of subsidizing meat consumption, and possibly the need for a meat tax, which other researchers have talked about as well. So I think that it's a great potential solution, but I think that we need changes, working with farmers, working with industry, behavioral changes, as well as subsidies, taxes, and environmental labels, which are used, I don't know if it's more frequently in Europe, but I think they're more common. And it's becoming something that's being talked about here more in the United States.
Next question. What opportunities are available for registered dietitians that want to be more involved with sustainability?
Yes, for anyone who's interested in becoming more involved with sustainability and you're a registered dietitian, I would urge you to become a member of the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group. They're considered authorities and leader in the field of sustainability. One of the benefits of a membership is you get access to the Journal of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition, as well as other resources on sustainability. So that's one way I can think of. You know, there are numerous master's degrees programs that are being offered in sustainability. I don't know what other degrees you have, but starting with joining the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group, I think would be a good place to start. And they have a lot of people who are doing different things. They could give you advice.
Great, thank you. This next question is an interesting one about cost. Is there a higher cost to the consumer when shopping for foods that are commonly consumed in a plant-based diet, or is this offset by the decrease in meat intake, which may also be costly?
Well, I've seen one recent analysis. I included that in my presentation when I talked about you know, the reduction in the environmental footprint by following either a flexitarian or vegetarian diet. And that author, Chen et al., they found that actually that the meat-heavy diets actually cost more than the ones that were not. And you know, one could argue that makes sense because meat is a very expensive food item, and you could use that money instead to buy plant-based proteins. Of course, you know, the other part of that equation is helping people with cooking and skilling. You know, a lot of people have become de-skilled, and so, you know, you can buy these items, but you have to learn how to prepare them. So that's the other part of the equation that I say we need to consider, in addition to cost, time, and cooking skills, which again, I think that RDs could play a role in working with clients as well as businesses and institutions.
Great. I'm seeing several questions, so I'll paraphrase, about almond milk as an alternative, or some others like oat and other milk substitutes as an alternative to soy. You know, from a sustainability perspective, from a nutrition perspective, curious your thoughts.
Okay, so yes, almond milk. Don't have anything against almond milk. The one thing I would note from a sustainability standpoint, it has been noted that, that almonds have a higher water footprint compared to some other nuts. And then the other thing is, my understanding is that the soy milk has, you know, higher protein content than almond milk. And if you look at, for example, you know, the dietary guidelines and looking at which, you know, foods in terms of categorization because of their nutrient content, you know, I think it's important to consider, you know, looking at dairy and soy as good protein sources, but with regard to almond milks, not so much. You know, that's my general knowledge on the topic.
Thank you. So there's a question about the seeming paradox, this is an interesting one, between, you know, the need to reduce sugar consumption overall, but also the, you know, many sources of sugars and other sweeteners from plants. And, you know, while we promote a plant-based diet, so, you know, cane, beet, corn, do you have any thoughts on this paradox, this balance?
Well, like I said, when we look at, you know, definitions for healthy, sustainable diets, you know, reductions of sugars, specifically sugary beverages. I mean, if we look within the diet at which, you know, foods and beverages are a problem, we note that sugary beverages are. If we look at consumption among teenagers and youth, it's particularly troubling, the marketing strategies, especially towards high-risk audiences. So I'm thinking, you know, what are the major contributors? And for me, you know, the sugary beverages, I think, really stand out as a problem, especially with the combination of marketing strategies, you know, online, digital marketing now, especially because kids are so savvy that way, and marketers know that. So I don't know if that's a really detailed answer to your question, But yeah, we want to have, a balance in the diet. We know we can't exclude anything, but overconsumption of sugar, I think, is definitely not something to promote.
Of course. I just want to give a heads up. We have about 5 minutes left. We are still getting lots of questions coming in, so I'm doing my best to try to read through them and ask. We'll try to get through a couple more before we end. So this one, how can consumers identify food products that are produced in a sustainable manner? And I guess how can we as practitioners help them know how to identify these foods?
Okay, yeah, how can consumers identify foods in the marketplace? One thing that I touched upon briefly is the use of carbon labels. These are becoming more common in the United States. And for example, restaurants such as Panera Bread, they have what they call cool food meals. And this is actually part of that initiative from the World Resources Institute, the Cool Foods Initiative, coolfood.org. And so in terms of looking at, eating out or, say eating at work at an institution, I mean, there are definitely, those types of things that, organizations like World Resources Institute are starting to implement, and they are seeing differences, positive differences. There's also something called an Ecosmart Label. Now, again, this is in Europe, not necessarily in the United States, at least as far as I know, unless I haven't heard about it yet. And this Ecosmart Label, includes a number as well as a color coding scheme from green, yellow to red. So this is something that I imagine could be more common in the marketplace in the United States. With regard to sustainability, Europe, in my opinion, tends to be ahead of us. So that is something that I think is becoming and will increasingly becoming more carbon, the use of environmental labels similar to nutrition labels.
There were a few questions about the Planetary Health Diet and where to find the resource and the imagery.
Okay, yeah. The Planetary Health Diet, if you go to the Eat Forum website, so you just Google Eat Forum, and they have, a large number of resources. They have the picture of the Planetary Health plate. They have the summary report. They have other resources as well. So Eat Forum, the website, is where you can find a range of resources, including the picture of the plate.
Great. And there was a follow-up question on that. Is there a chart that has the breakdown in terms of servings per day, per week, similar to how the dietary guideline breaks down some of their?
I haven't seen it. I've seen other things where people make the translation. I try to remind myself that we're in the United States, we don't use the metric system, but the rest of the world does. But I think I don't know about it if there's one that's consistently being circulated. It's just a matter of doing the different translations based on the different products, liquids versus solids, etc. But I'm not aware of something that's easily accessible using servings based on non-metric metrics.
This is an interesting one. I don't know if there's any research on this, so you'll let me know. Is there any evidence on some of those meal delivery services that are growing in popularity, like HelloFresh and Blue Apron, and their impact on sustainability?
Yeah, the one that I think is truest, and it's not necessarily a meal delivery service, they have the community-supported agriculture, and so that's something that, has been around for a while, and basically what you do is you buy a share ahead of time from a farm or a farmer. And, when I had a membership in a CSA, I lived in Houston for many years before we moved to Dallas, and the woman who ran that, she delivered everything right to our door, and it was wonderful, fresh food, just, freshly picked, absolutely delicious. In terms of prepared food items, I don't, off the top of my head, know of any analyses based on their effect of sustainability. Again, you want to make sure we're looking at additional costs, what's the waste involved? I don't have an answer for that question, but I would say something like a CSA, which is a community-supported agriculture farm, a subscription. That, in my mind, would be truer to sustainability in terms of supporting the farmer, the small to medium-sized farmer, and getting health benefits from the nutrition and the nutritious food items that are provided from the farmer.
Makes sense. Christine, thank you so much again. We are at 3 o'clock, so apologies to those of you whose questions I didn't get to ask. We will keep a log of that, and we really appreciate all of the engagement today. I'm going to turn it over to Jack to close us out for the day.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda, for moderating today. That was an awesome presentation. What a great audience and great questions. So thank you so much for moderating. Thank you. And thank you, Christine, for spending the afternoon with us and for sharing your expertise with the Today's Dietitian audience.
My pleasure always.
And again, thank you to Danone North America for supporting Today's Dietitian and the Today's Dietitian audience through quality educational programming like today's session.
Instructions for credit claiming and downloading handouts should be up on your screen. You must complete a brief evaluation of the course in order to claim your credit and download your certificate. Registered dietitians should use code 175 when recording this activity in their professional development portfolio. If you are watching this webinar on our YouTube channel, please log into ce.todaysdietitian.com, click on the Webinars tab, and select this webinar in order to complete it for credit. If you are watching this webinar on our CE Learning Library website, click Next, or return to the course start page and select the evaluation step to complete this webinar for credit.